Good evening and welcome to the latest in the Royal Institute of Philosophy's series of London lectures of Philosophers Manifesto. I'm Julian Bergini. This series of talks, we've invited philosophers from all parts of the world and different backgrounds, philosophical traditions, to present a philosophical case for a particular policy or new law. And we've had a very, very diverse group indeed. And this evening we have Catherine Rowett. Catherine is a professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia, but a rare philosopher who also got her hands dirty in the grubby business of politics, being elected as one of the 7 UK Green MEPs, the European Parliament, and managing, of course, to get elected about a year, less than a year before the UK actually left the Parliament. So she didn't have a lot of time to get an impact, but it was quite an achievement to get there. Not many philosophers can claim to have done what she's done. This evening, Catherine's going to make the case for the universal basic income. We've heard a lot about that, and there'll be a little bit in the talk, I'm sure, about some of the politics of it. But what we're really interested in is the philosophy behind it. What's the philosophical case for it? So Catherine's going to talk for around half an hour, and then we're going to have a discussion, and there can be questions from you, of course. Just type them into the chat box. A request about the questions, try and keep them, first of all, under 200 characters. That way they can be displayed on screen, should we choose to select it. And secondly, do remember that there are all sorts of different people watching this talk. So the question is not your opportunity to display your erudition by making erudite references to things. Make the question simple and crystal clear so that not only Catherine can understand it, but somebody who knows nothing about this could understand it as well. With that polite request out of the way, let's start by hearing Catherine's talk.
Thank you, Julian, for the kind introduction. So tonight I'm advocating a universal basic income for everyone. I'm assuming that you all know roughly what that is, so I'm going to sketch the political reasons for it quite briefly at the beginning as a kind of manifesto before heading into the philosophical issues that are the real subject of my lecture. So if we had a universal basic income, what would change? Let's start by thinking about which things matter most in your life. We don't have time to do the work on this right now, but the idea is to enter these things into the boxes with the most valuable ones first and then the least valuable ones further down. So feel free to have a go in your own time. So here are some of the suggestions: having lots of money to spend, love and friendship, caring for others, being out in the natural world, doing a worthwhile or satisfying job, maybe changing people's minds, campaigning, ending injustice, time to study and improve oneself. Again, let's think about things which things are most costly to society. Can we order them from worst to least? For sure, we'd need to find out some information to be sure of which is the most costly, in fact. One helpful statistic is that about £2 billion is lost in benefit fraud in the UK, and about £16 billion of benefits go unclaimed by those who are entitled to them. Meanwhile, the tax gap, people avoiding tax, undeclared income and so on, so that's not paying tax that should be paid, is officially said by the government to be only £35 billion. Much of that's avoided by cash-in-hand self-employed people. But the real figure has been calculated by Richard Murphy to be more like £90 billion if we include the avoidance schemes used by the super-rich, such as using offshore havens. So which of these costly things to society would be solved, or at least alleviated, by a simple basic income? And would solving some of these quickly pay for the costs of it? So here are some options: maybe mental health and depression, debt and loan sharks, drug addiction, stress-related illness, family breakdown, poor diet and fast food, child poverty, social stigma. All these things are really costly to society. Now let's ask why our society is so full of those terrible things. Why would we want a world so full of misery? Why not change it? Here are some changes we could make using UBI. What if we set people free to learn, to create, to form relationships, to move to where they can find the best thing to do with their lives? What if we made the employee free and the employer the beggar? What if we stopped selling our country for jobs when that means selling the labour of our people to make cheap profits for foreign firms and for their shareholders who keep their unearned income untaxed in offshore havens? What if the money we put into the pockets of people made the tax revenues bigger? Here are some reasons to think that the effect of UBI would be a net benefit to the Treasury and a great boost to enterprise, the arts and local businesses. People spend money if they have it. People create businesses if they have the security to do it. People get themselves better educated if they have the time to do it. People can achieve things if they're not depressed or struggling to pay the bills. People can see their loved ones and give them the attention they need if they're free to work part-time. When people are happy, they do things to make the world a better place. They smile. Now, what's the difference between a universal basic income and a tax-free allowance? Many opponents say we don't need to change the system from having a tax-free allowance to having a cash handout instead. They forget that when you have nothing, when you lose your job, become ill or have to self-isolate, what you need is a cash handout, not an imaginary opportunity to earn some money you don't pay tax on. Your problem is that you don't have the money to not pay tax on it, and you have no way to get it. Only a UBI offers the ever-present safety net that sets you free. So let's get on to the philosophical issues. Of course, freedom is one of them, but my first issue is about fairness and justice. We want life to be fair, but what counts as fair? What would a fair society look like? And do we live in a fair society? People's pre-philosophical intuitions about fairness seem to conflict. Some think it's fair if people receive rewards according to what they deserve, and it's unfair if some get something for nothing. And some think, on the other hand, that it's fair if initial disadvantages are remedied and reparations are made to make good the unfairness of life chances. So it would be fair to give more to those with less and less to those with more than enough. Some advocates for universal basic income try to connect it with that idea of giving people only what they deserve, and this involves thinking up some reason why everyone is deserving of enough income to get by. One argument for this tries to suggest that everyone, including the least productive members of society, are entitled to a share of the Earth's resources, as if we owned our own little bit and are entitled to reap the dividends from our share, even if someone else is actually extracting the resources. This seems to me to be fanciful. And it also buys into a problematic notion of private property and the right to proceeds from that property. And even if we did think we all own some bit of nature, who's to say that the dividend from that share would be exactly the right amount of income to cover the basics of a good life? But on the second notion of fairness, we might think that the poorer people should get more and the rich should get less. So why would we give everyone the same then? Here's another way of being fair. Some things need to be distributed unequally, not according to desert, but according to need, to be fair. For instance, shoes. I need size 4 and you need size 11. It's no good giving everyone a size 9 to ensure that no one has a bigger share than anyone else. So disability benefits are like that. To make life equal, a person needs whatever will bring their quality of life up to that of others who haven't got a disability. The cost of a good life, by contrast, is roughly the same for all. Everyone needs a room in a house, a bed of the same size, enough good high-quality food, and a bicycle. Children need the same, or maybe a bit smaller. This is roughly true no matter whether we are large or small, rich or poor, wise or foolish. So why not just give everyone the same? For sure, it doesn't take account of the differential level of risk faced by someone with large savings compared with someone who just gets by. But as a blunt tool, it gives everyone the same protection in times of dearth and when their savings have run dry. So maybe a UBI is not quite fair by either model then. It doesn't give more or less based on desert, it doesn't make reparation by giving more to the least well off, and it doesn't level up the poor or level down the rich, or at least not by itself. But it does take everyone's basic needs and says, don't worry about those, they're covered. No one's left out, there's no moralising or judgment, no penalty for being rich, no penalty for being disadvantaged. So it's a kind of fairness that says that being human is the same for all, and no one is worth more or less than anyone else. Is our society currently fair by either standard? We have a regressive tax system. Poorer people work long hours for low pay and then pay a higher proportion of their income in taxes than the wealthy. The billionaires pay the least of all. This is partly because of the stealth taxes, which are predominantly paid by the poor, and partly because of the tax thresholds, aggravated by various loopholes that allow the super rich to reduce their tax bills. So the poor pay more and earn less. In terms of the contribution made by each sector of society in practical service and usefulness, again the situation is topsy-turvy. Many on low or middle incomes are servicing the fundamental provisions of a modern society, as we've seen so clearly during our current pandemic. Teachers, nurses, healthcare workers, those caring for the elderly, postmen, bin men, road maintenance, plumbing, heating engineers, doctors, scientists and the police. Many of these jobs are vocation careers. People choose to do them not for the pay, but to do something good. This reveals a mismatch between the value of the work and the monetary rewards, or indeed the status. And besides, there's another huge body of work that's completely unpaid. Nurturing relationships, caring for the elderly, nursing a sick child, not to mention political campaigning, standing for election, and all the other things that good citizens do for nothing. When we ask who is doing the most for our society and who is most highly rewarded, we see that there's no correlation. Think of the huge contribution made by those who work for nothing or very low pay, and the huge potential of those who could, if they had the resources, do creative things or access education, but can't because they have to take menial jobs. It's obvious that giving a basic wage to everyone and a basic allowance to every child would result in a fairer and more equitable provision to ensure that no one is working for nothing and no one lacks the resources to make their contribution meaningful. Talking about what's worthwhile or meaningful leads us on to our next topic. What are the goals of a good society? What's our ambition for our community, or as the ancients would say, our polis? Do we, for example, prize freedom or culture or intellectual achievement or the leisure time to pursue these goals, or do we prize conformity, drudgery, compliance, servitude? What is it to be a great and admirable human being, and in what kind of society is it possible for people to live well to the best that a human being can achieve? When ancient philosophers asked this question, they would be asking about eudaimonia, about enjoying the blessings of good fortune. How can we create a society that delivers that? The Platonist asks, what is the good, and how can we create a society oriented towards that? The Aristotelian asks, what would allow human beings to achieve a life that approximates to that of the God who just sits and thinks and who has no need to work? These ancient questions are questions we really should ask for our own time, and we really should answer them properly. There seem to me to be two answers from the ancient world that deserve attention, and two from the modern world that need to be rejected. From the ancient world, first, that the good life is the life of leisure as distinct from the life of a slave. And second, that what makes that important is the freedom to do the unslavish things that one can do only if one has the leisure to do them. The value of being free is pictured in contrast to the life of a slave, though there's also a more positive model of the worker who is a self-employed craftsman or doctor whose goal is to produce good work and be pleased with it, not in service to a master, but for the sake of the value of what's achieved. By contrast, in the modern world, at least in the Protestant North, it's hard to resist the impression that goal number one is to accumulate wealth, a goal that appears to be thought of as successfully achieved if a small minority are very wealthy and the rest destitute. Hence the use of generic GDP figures or rises in average income to measure improvements. And surely goal number two is to see that the rest of the people are employed in creating the wealth for the lucky few, and no one is avoiding that duty. It looks rather like a goal of enslaving the many to deliver wealth for the few, but with a total lack of any consideration of whether the resulting life, for anyone, either rich or poor, is a good one or worth having for anyone. And why the focus on jobs? Both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party always want people to be in jobs. Why exactly? Let's look briefly at some famous attempts to speak out against the focus on jobs. So I'll start with Bertrand Russell's little essay of 1932, In Praise of Idleness. I want to say in all seriousness that a great deal of harm is being done in the modern world by belief in the virtuousness of work, and that the road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organised diminution of work, says Russell partway through that essay. After all, in wartime we see that the country can exist and produce enough for everyone to live on, while a large part of the workforce is diverted to fighting or making ammunition. So in peacetime, we clearly don't need everyone working full-time 5 days a week. Russell suggests cutting it to a 4-day week. In practice, in a market economy, the effect of making too much stuff is that some people end up out of work and destitute. Here's Russell's example of the pin makers. Suppose that at a given moment a certain number of people are engaged in the manufacture of pins. They make as many pins as the world needs, working, say, 8 hours a day. Someone makes an invention by which the same number of men can make twice as many pins. Pins are already so cheap that hardly any more will be bought at a lower price. In a sensible world, everybody concerned in the manufacturing of pins would take to working 4 hours instead of 8, and everything else would go on as before. But in the actual world, this would be thought demoralising. The men still work 8 hours, there are too many pins, some employers go bankrupt, and half the men previously concerned in making pins are thrown out of work. There is, in the end, just as much leisure as on the other plan, but half the men are totally idle, while half are still overworked. In this way it is ensured that the unavoidable leisure shall cause misery all round, instead of being a universal source of happiness. Can anything more insane be imagined? In the late 20th century, this problem was partly solved by the throwaway society and the role of advertising. Advertising can make us want more and more stuff we don't need, and throw away more and more perfectly serviceable stuff, so as to buy ever more stuff and never have enough. Settling for enough would undermine the need to employ more and more people doing pointless things and selling wasteful products to make money for the rich. Hence the situation that Marcuse diagnosed in 1964. Our next slide. So in 1964, Herbert Marcuse wrote One-Dimensional Man. He suggested that we're trapped in a system that constantly persuades us that we must have more stuff, and to have more stuff we must work longer hours and earn more money, as if happiness could be bought with material objects. This system is serviced by advertising and propaganda. It traps us into a cycle of unnecessary work, destroying our judgment and leaving us with no time, energy or inclination to resist. For this lecture, I could have chosen to propose a shorter working week, as Russell suggested. That is also a Green Party policy. But it seems to me that his practical proposal was still somewhat stuck in the notion that it would be good to ensure that there are jobs for everyone. That's still the old model that thinks that people should and must be employed, gainfully employed, in some kind of drudgery for at least part of their time. So his practical solution seems not fully to have taken on board his observation that idleness is better than drudgery. Why might we think that people ought to be employed in paid drudgery for all or some of their time? Here's Bertrand Russell again. The idea that the poor should have leisure has always been shocking to the rich. In England in the early 19th century, 15 hours was the ordinary day's work for a man. Children sometimes did as much, and very commonly did 12 hours a day. When meddlesome busybodies suggested that perhaps these hours were rather long, they were told that work kept adults from drink and children from mischief. And then Russell continues, when I was a child, shortly after urban working men had acquired the vote, certain public holidays were established by law, to the great indignation of the upper classes. I remember hearing an old duchess say, "What do the poor want with holidays? They ought to work." People nowadays are less frank, but the sentiment persists and is the source of much of our economic confusion. In this attitude, we can hear an echo of Aristotle's idea of the natural slave. The idea that some people are incapable of the rational life of the mind and of the activities of a free person, and that such people should be put to work, since that is all that they are fit for. Russell's defence of idleness has been followed by a trickle of similar advocates over the century, and there's also a parallel discussion concerning the idea of meaningful work as opposed to useless toil, as William Morris put it. Here the idea is that some work is worth doing, whereas some of it is work in bullshit jobs. But it's worth noting that meaningful work doesn't necessarily provide a wage. If it's worth doing and important, we want to do it anyway. Setting people free to do that and to spend their precious time on what's actually meaningful and creative would be an act of superb transformation. And that, as I shall suggest, is what a universal basic income could do. A UBI would effect a superb transformation partly because it would undo a very destructive power system that makes our society deeply exploitative. Most people are not free to leave their job, even if it's a bullshit job, even if it's a job producing stuff that makes the world a nastier place for everyone. People have to stick with a job that keeps the wolf from the door. Employers have no incentive to make their workplace civilised, pleasant or free of bullying and intimidation. Picture a society of utterly miserable people commuting miles to work in horrible jobs all day, getting home too late to see their children, because if they didn't go, they wouldn't be able to pay the bills. A universal basic income would reverse this situation. People would for sure want some additional income. It will always be desirable to add a little luxury to the basics that might be covered, even in a generous and sufficient basic income. And it will always be rewarding to get a worthwhile job that pays well and makes you feel good. So people would still want jobs or various kinds of productive employment. But no one would be trapped in bad jobs at risk of destitution if they turned down a job that was either worthless or badly paid. These claims have been tested in some of the pilot studies. See, for example, the ones in India and Finland. Beggars can't be choosers, but once you make them no longer beggars, you can make them choosers. To have the choice of saying no to a job if the work is appalling or distressing is to be free. And to decide to take a break from the job and do something different, to have the means to better yourself, to take yourself to college and find a new skill, to start a business in a niche that you would love to fit. These are the things that make life worthwhile and lead to a creative and innovative society instead of a society of drudgery and pointless toil. So how, if at all, would this address the ills of a modern society? As things stand, we pay people too little so that they're unable to afford decent food. We then have to produce terrible food for those who can't afford to eat well. The minimum wage is not enough to enable anyone to eat well. This has two consequences. It is damaging to the planet and the ecosystem, and it's costly to the health service. As things stand, people are stressed by hours of commuting, unpleasant jobs that they must go to every day, pressure from the stigma of poverty, and the money worries that break up families and destroy relationships. The savings in mental health, physical health, stress-related illness, family breakdown, and domestic abuse would be considerable. But we should count those savings not just in terms of the monetary costs. If we go back to that question of what kind of society we want to live in, the real question is, why would we ever set up a set of values that delivers such misery for so many people? And how easy would it be to change that? And then there's the environment. Many people would commute less far, take more interesting jobs close to home, set up a small business, do voluntary work in the neighbourhood, make their community a happier place. Automation makes many jobs that used to be necessary unnecessary. But no one gets to benefit from that if we keep making more tat in order to make more paid jobs. The tat, the fast fashion, the latest fast gadgets, and the fossil fuels we use to make them, and the waste from throwing the old ones away, and the energy used to transport it and sell it. These are the things that are killing the planet. To sum up, I'd like to suggest that not only would this system constitute a much simpler solution to the conundrum that Joe Wolfe was concerned about, of the poverty trap that criminalises those who earn a little extra money while on benefits. It would also have much greater and more meaningful transformative power. As we come through the worst year of peacetime any of us have known, we've been forced to realise how easy it is to find that the income has just dried up and there's nothing. A myth about the way public finances are funded has made people suppose that the poor must always pay the costs of whatever the state has to subsidise, and that state borrowing must be reduced by cutting the things it funds. But that's a confusion. Spending is an investment that reaps dividends if it's spent on enterprising solutions to the things that are costly and destructive. Austerity programmes increase hardship, put more workers into benefits and more people out of work. They generate a spiral of increasing misery and despair and a collapse in public revenue. In building back better, we need to think about what kind of better we want to build. The fact is that we can afford this universal basic income system, which would pay dividends in every single measure of the good life, and would eliminate a huge army of bureaucrats whose current task is to assess whether the poor have reached a sufficiently dire level of poverty to be worth saving. So that's my case. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, indeed. Nice of you to mention, by the way, Joe Wolfe's talk earlier in our series on benefits cheats, and all the talks are, of course, available to watch afterwards for as long as there is a YouTube on our YouTube channel. To begin with, it's worth saying, of course, that when people come across the universal basic income idea, often their first response is to talk about it being impractical and utopian and so forth. And we're not talking about the practicalities today, but if you are interested in that, there's plenty of information out there. For example, the RSA has done quite a lot of work looking at the practicality of universal basic income. So there's plenty out there if you want to sort of like get yourself up to speed on whether or not it is practical or not. But Catherine's really focused more on the philosophical case, and that's what I want to talk about right now. I've got some questions coming in already, but before we come to them, I'm going to just take advantage and ask a few myself. Please do keep the questions coming through the chat. So, Catherine, thanks for that. Can I just start off a bit by talking about this idea of fairness? Because I think it was quite interesting that you actually claimed that universal basic income wasn't much good for several measures of fairness. You thought that the kind of fairness and it perhaps worked best for was a kind of a fairness which, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of sees a kind of equal value of all human life and therefore gives a sort of equal distribution of basic goods to everybody. But there's another kind of fairness which I don't know whether you covered it in what you said, but people often talk about equality of opportunity. Now, clearly, universal basic income doesn't create anything like absolute equality of opportunity. You've still got the super rich and everything. But a lot of the time, what we're looking for is not actually perfect equality anyway. It's removing the most egregious inequalities. And lack of opportunity really is one of the worst kinds of inequality. And I was wondering whether or not perhaps the case for UBI is strong in that direction. And by analogy, if we think about development aid, for example, a lot of people claim development aid is not very useful or very wasteful. But it seems to be very effective when you put cash directly into people's pockets. That seems to be one of the most effective forms of development aid there is. So what do you think about that, about the UBI's? I mean, first of all, are we right to value equality of opportunity? Is it good for equality of opportunity? And if it is, why do you think perhaps the other form of fairness that you talked about was more important, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it actually really is very helpful to equality of opportunity, and I suppose I could have focused on that. I was focusing, I guess, in my discussion of fairness more on the question, is it fair to give people this, as opposed to what kind of fairness would it deliver? And the fairness of what it delivers, I didn't consider so much under the notion of fairness as under the notion of would it give us a good life. But I think it is true that while we're thinking about equality and fairness, we probably should think about equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity is one of the things that is, if there aren't equal opportunities, then that's a distinctly unfair society. I think universal basic income would at least help with some of those things. The opportunity to get an education, for example. I mean, of course, you can see universal basic income helping with a great range of different things. For example, student finance. At the moment, we don't have straightforward student grants. This would effectively be a straightforward student grant. But it would also enable people to stay on in the sixth form and to go back to college at any time of their life. So lots of opportunities to get back onto ladders that you fell off due to disadvantages. Obviously, it wouldn't get rid of all the disadvantages that make it difficult for people to do things right in the first place. But it would often, I think, help with things where people had been disadvantaged by a lack of a good start in life. As I said, it doesn't it doesn't undo unfairnesses that are built into our current system. It just makes sure that nobody gets to the situation where they've got nothing that could help.
Thanks. There's actually a related question from Paul Harnett, which I think we can get up here. You were talking about the Paul Harnett one, if possible. Sorry, it sometimes happens that I mention one question, a different one comes up. Here we go. Thank you. So you were talking about you were focusing more on whether it would be fair to actually give people this money in the first place. And the question here from Paul Harnett is about how the commons has been. If we go back to the Paul Harnett one, the commons, land, air and sea, co-created data, ancestral wealth, all these things have been plundered by the super rich. And it's therefore, I love the way the system's going crazy. Are we fanciful to charge for their use and distribute a dividend basic income? Now, I mean, there's a specific question there, obviously, but I think it raises a more general point, which is this, that when you talk about fairness, isn't there a kind of presumption that you need a rationale to, as it were, take from some to give to others, whereas actually it's underestimating the extent to which most of the wealth in the society as a whole has a claim on? I mean, how far would you go with that argument? And maybe you could explain perhaps the argument a bit better than I have done in brief summary.
Well, it's interesting because I thought somebody might come up with a question about the commons, because it's really interesting to think in terms of the extent to which things that were in the past, the commons, things that were held in common and everybody had equal access to, such as fresh air, for example, and a clean sea and things, they have been variously destroyed, and with unequal results in many cases. So I think it's fair to suggest that there's an imbalance, and that the plundering of these resources and the spoiling of these resources has been very much, I mean, if we think on a global scale, the damage has been very largely done by the industrialized developed countries since the Industrial Revolution. We've messed up the commons, and of course before that, land was enclosed that used to be held in common. So a lot of the injustices and inequalities of society have arisen out of the privatization of things that used to be commons, and from the destruction of the commons by people who are extracting or polluting. And I think some sense of reparation for that problem is appropriate. But one of the reasons why I was reluctant to go down the, oh, we all own a little bit, so we all are entitled to a private revenue from it, is that I think that the enclosure of the commons and the privatization of the commons is part of the problem. So I wouldn't really want to push down a route that says everybody's entitled to their share, because the problem is that once everybody takes a share, there may actually not be enough.
Okay, thanks so much. I've actually got quite a lot of interesting questions coming in. I often like to abuse my position by asking too many of my own, but I'm going to take more from the audience. We have one here. Let's see if the coming up on the screen works. There's something a bit buggy this evening. The Sevens Burns. Here we go. So this, I assume Sevens Burns is a family rather than a solicitor's firm or something similar. Is there a possibility that a UBI may be seen by employers as an opportunity not to pay adequately? What safeguards might be put in place to ensure this system isn't taken advantage of? Now, I mean, partly that's a practical question about safeguards, but I suppose there's a principal question, isn't there? People say UBI lets people off the hook, essentially. It sort of legitimizes low pay because people have their pay from the state. And in a sense, it would be a possibility of an unintended outcome. So yes. What do you make of that?
So as you say, there's a practical side. Would this happen? And there's a sort of fairness and justification side. Does it matter? So let's think about the practical side. Would it happen? If there are jobs that people want to do, then with a UBI, people would take the jobs that they want to do, and it wouldn't necessarily matter whether they were paid at all, right? That you could choose to do things voluntarily, and in particular, you might well choose to work in the community or for charities and things like that without taking any pay at all. And that's a really interesting possibility, because it seems as if the job is worth doing, and people can afford to do it, that would actually cut the cost of employing people for those jobs that people feel are worth doing. And that would potentially make savings in the public sector, for example, and for charities. But if a job is not attractive and is in any way unpleasant to do, then in order to get people to work, people are going to have to pay enough to make it worth their while to take that job. And that would have very interesting consequences for some of the more unpleasant jobs in society, including, of course, some public sector jobs. Where again, it might be the case that we would actually end up having to pay more for those people whom we found we really relied on in the pandemic. So there would be a shift and a change. And the other thing to say about that is that if you actually think about the system that we have at the moment with universal credit, many people are on in-work benefits because the pay that they're getting or the hours that they're getting are not enough to live on. And so they're in paid work, but the minimum wage is below what's needed for them to live. They then have to have housing benefit in addition, which goes into paying a private landlord. And what in effect is being done is subsidising very, very low wages that are not enough to live on and very high rents that are higher than the market would actually bear because the public purse is paying. So actually, this situation is already there. And I think with a universal basic income, it would be in a fairer way because nobody would be forced to do the unpleasant jobs, and those jobs would have to pay.
It's very, very interesting. I mean, this issue raises perhaps a broader one, which is, I mean, you've been focusing on the sort of philosophical case rather than the practical case. But I wonder whether, I mean, some people might think that whole enterprise is flawed because you're talking about something which is practical. And if one doesn't sort of have the economics and sorted out, the practical matter sorted out, you know, the theory goes out the window. And so, I mean, one possibility that's been raised here is actually it would mean that people have to pay more for a lot of jobs like shop work and so forth. And this could actually have the effect, say, of raising prices because, you know, supermarkets and even small stores have to work on very small margins. And your Russell example I thought was interesting as well because, you know, Russell thought it was, as a philosopher, not as an economist, ridiculous that if you can produce twice the number of pins with the same work, that you don't simply halve the hours. But I'm sure there are economists who would say, that is a ridiculously naive and simplistic thing to say because, of course, the way in which you achieve greater productivity over the long run is to translate those efficiency gains into something which has an economic impact. I mean, in a sense, you're not getting any efficiency. You're getting an efficiency gain in terms of people's time off, but not in anything else. And now there's a debate to be had there about whether the economists are valuing things rightly, wrongly, and so forth. But the bottom line seems to be that as soon as you start drilling down into this, you get into very, very practical, empirical matters about what will work and what won't work. So do you think there are sort of limits as to how far, what you can do as a philosopher to make this case? And are you risking perhaps doing the Russell thing of being naive if you don't really look at the economics of every single thing you're proposing?
I don't think that Russell was being naive on that, actually. I mean, the question that that you're assuming is that the efficiency gains should go into greater economic productivity. And what I was arguing was that the efficiency gains should go, and what Russell was arguing was that the efficiency gains should go into leisure and an equal distribution of leisure instead of forcing some people out of work and some people into work. And of course, the Marcuse thing is about the fact that if we keep saying, well, unless we're getting greater productivity, we're not improving life, so we must get greater productivity. But in order to get greater productivity and not having people out of work, we must want more staff and new tat, and we must throw away the old. Why are our waste? Why is the ocean full of plastic waste? Because we've been throwing away stuff so that we can have new stuff, right? And the reason for that is that people have promoted the idea that we must have single-use stuff and throw away stuff because that's how you can keep producing more, because you always need more the next day. And if you don't check your values and naively think that more productivity is good, and we must make more stuff, and we must have people making more stuff, and we must want more stuff, if you don't check the values on that, you will naively think that all those pin men should be working full time, 5 days a week, making more stuff. And if it's not pins that are wanted, make something else. Make something else. Well, we didn't need anything else, right?
By the way, I should say that I don't necessarily agree with my questions. I just think they're
No,
questions that should be asked.
that. Yeah. Devil's advocate and all that. Yes.
Yeah. But on that point, I mean, again, so the thing I would say is, of course, there should come a point at which we don't just keep the idea that we just keep increasing our economic output, increasing GDP ad infinitum is ridiculous. But there's also the risk that, from a kind of privileged Western point of view, it's very easy for us to assume that economic development's gone as far as it needs to go, and now we need to focus on other things, when actually there are huge parts of the world that are still poor. And so arguably, we haven't reached the point yet where we should be giving up on economic growth and focusing on other things, because there's still a lot of poverty in the world. Again, what do you make of that point?
Which brings us back, of course, to the issue of fairness, not just within a single society, but across societies, and the question of whether something like this is really necessary for the whole world, so that you can ensure that you upgrade the spending power of those in the global south, and decrease the spending power of those in the global north, so that the amount of excessive consumption that goes on in the traditional industrialized societies can be reduced, while enabling those who sit very lightly on the planet to sit just a little bit more heavily on the planet, and raise their standard of living just a little bit, so that we all reach what is actually comfort.
Okay, now I've got a question from a very intelligent dog called Sean. If we can bring this up here. Yeah, there we go. Sean Kavanagh is a very smart young puppy here, and because you mentioned there in your comments about Russell about we should use this for leisure, which is interesting. Now the point is, what do we mean by leisure? How do you conceptualize that? I think it's a fair point. Good question.
Yes, that's right. So I guess I was sort of picking up on the idea of leisure from the ancient philosophers. And it may be that the notion of leisure, as understood by the ancient philosophers, thinking about it and thinking about this question, I'm beginning to think that maybe I was a little bit naive in rushing into thinking that I could just use the term leisure in the talk, without thinking about the fact that what leisure means for us is perhaps a little different from what leisure meant when the ancients put such a high priority on ensuring that the free person has leisure. So they were thinking that obviously you need leisure in order to be an engaged citizen. I mean, of course, it varies a bit. I hate it when people say all the ancient philosophers thought something, and obviously it depended a little bit on the political system that you're in, and whether political engagement would lead you to despair or to success, and so on. But the thought was that what's good about being a free person is that you run your own life, you take your own decisions, nobody else tells you what to do, and the things that you choose to do are the things that are actually worthwhile, that you have judged to be the things that you would want to do with your free life. So it's not an inactive life of lolling around on sofas waiting for something to happen, or even just sitting in cinemas and being fed ready-made entertainment. And I guess that part of the problem is that we've sunk into being a consumer society where the expectation is that somebody else does the entertaining, and we just sit around and watch it. And I think probably I'm thinking of a more participatory sort of leisure, where what you would immediately do if you'd got some time, say 1 day a week that you didn't have to go to work, or maybe 4 days a week that you didn't have to go to work because you could earn enough by going to something that just wanted 1 day a week. With the rest of that time, you would be out doing active stuff that you think is really worthwhile. Not necessarily out, but in your art workshop, or in the community, or in the garden, or doing charity work, voluntary work, looking after the aged parents, visiting the sick, whatever motivated you to find that life was worthwhile, other than just working for money.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's true. I think in the contemporary age, we do think of leisure very much in terms of relaxation, and often of the most frivolous kind, whereas that's clearly not the kind of leisure you're talking about. It's freedom from work. Please do keep the questions coming. We got some good ones in. We also like your icons. So if you can be a dog, or you can be, as we're going to see next, actually a flower. Flower is one of our regulars at these talks. Welcome back, Flower. Should the super rich be entitled to the same basic income? Of course, this is a question I think that's asked a lot, because it is universal, right? Which means Bill Gates gets it too. Philosophically, is that fair?
So that was, of course, one of the issues that I was raising in the connection with fairness. The thought that it doesn't rectify imbalances because it just treats everybody the same, and so it neither considers desert, nor does it consider your existing ability. Your existing resources. It doesn't make good a lack of resources in those that lack it, and so that's what it seems like at first. And of course, one of the joys of it is that it's simple, and nobody needs to means test you or decide whether you do or don't. And there's no cutoff point, and so there's no penalty that leads to the kind of difficulties that they weren't exactly the difficulties that Joe Wolf was looking at, but always when you have a cut-off point, as there are, for example, with the tax thresholds, there's a point where if you earn more, you get less, and that sort of thing. And any system that has thresholds and means testing and that sort of thing leads to real difficulties at the cutoff point. So you could say, well, never mind, you give it to the rich. There's only one rich person who's got the billionaire position. They get a little bit of money. It makes absolutely no difference to them. It doesn't increase their spending power. So why did you bother to give it to them? Well, the answer is partly you've got to have the simple system, and you get rid of all the bureaucrats that have to test whether you're entitled to it, and all the applications and all the disincentives to apply for it, and all the stigma. But in addition, think of it like this, right? So if you give that money to somebody who has no money, you turn somebody who has no spending power into somebody who has spending power. And that's really, really important for that person. When you give it to somebody who then earns a bit and pays tax on the bit extra, until they pay more tax than you gave them, they're getting a little bit more than they were earning. They're getting more, right? By earning and by having the revenue that was the universal basic income. After a bit, if they're earning more and paying more tax, then they pay more back than you gave them. So you're not actually giving them anything by the time they're paying more than you gave them. It looks like you're giving that to them because you'll give it to them. If they suddenly stopped earning, you would go on giving it to them. But while they're earning and have an income and are paying tax on it, then they will pay back far, far more, especially if they're exceedingly rich. And effectively, they'll have no free tax allowance. And at the moment, we give a free tax allowance to the Bill Gates and these people. They don't need a free tax allowance, right? But we give it to them anyway because that's universal. Instead of that, we give them a bit of income, which they immediately pay back, and then they pay tax on everything else at a high enough rate that they're actually contributing enough to ensure that we can give everybody something. So when you think about it, you're not really giving any to the super rich because they're paying for it. They're not really getting it.
Yeah, indeed. So the assumption they're getting more is based on the fact that you're not going to change the tax rates, and of course you can change the tax rates. You could actually change the tax rates, so they're paying even more tax. So they could be worse off under the system.
They could be worse off under this system. In fact, they probably should be worse off under the system. And you eliminate the tax-free allowance, so everybody who's earning pays the basic amount off their money as soon as they start to earn. So that simplifies the tax system as well, because any money that you earn, you owe that much tax on.
That is another reason, though, why it's good to give it to everybody, maybe, which is suggested by this question from Arda Help. Would you agree that any attempt to target creates others and hence causes divisions in society? So actually, the price you pay for not creating others is the rich get it too, right? But the upside of that is how much harm do you think is created by this? Because a lot of people think that it makes sense that help should be targeted to those who need it most, and if that means that people are categorized as qualifying for welfare or not and so forth, so be it, because that's the best way to target the help.
Yeah, so I think that we live in a society where the stigma attached to being one of those who's receiving things can be exceedingly distressing. And the division between the haves and have-nots and those who are dependent and those who are independent and so on, very damaging ways of sort of creating a sort of disapproval and negative attitudes and things. So I guess it's partly about trying to ensure that people feel free to ask for what they need, or rather, they don't even have to ask for it; they just get it. And okay, so there'll be some other things that they would have to ask for if they have special needs. And I'm not really going into issues about the housing costs, which is a different kettle of fish. But I think this question is very interesting. Yes, I must stop tapping the table.
Thanks. I've got another question coming in from Ilf Petrov. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. What kind of political system is more conducive for a practical application of UBI and the like? Does democracy seem to be plausible for you if it has failed to deliver anything like UBI so far? I mean, this is an interesting question because perhaps we can broaden it out a bit, because you're a Green MEP, and a lot of people say that democracy isn't the fit system for solving the climate crisis because it relies on 4 or 5 year electoral cycles. Parties are only concerned with that, and they need to appeal to their constituencies. So perhaps you can talk about perhaps both those things, both the UBI and, more generally speaking, environmental policies. Do we have a problem in having a democratic system?
I think it would be over hasty to blame democracy and the democratic system. We have a problem of short-termism and the problem that politicians look to trying to ensure that they can get re-elected rather than looking to the long-term best interests of the society. But I think that there are ways in which politicians should and could take more of a role in leading people to understand what it is that they should be choosing when they vote. And our problem with short-termism is not really to do with democracy, but with our drift towards popularism and towards trying to win votes by things that have short-term appeal, like tax cuts for something extra in your pocket, and also, certain actions to protect the environment might seem, on the face of it, to look like curtailments of freedom or interference in your ability to drive your car as much as you like, where you like, for not very much money for the petrol and so on. So things that people think that they value look as if they'd be under threat. So then the politicians are not prepared to put it into their manifestos because they think that they will lose the votes of those people. But of course, the task of a real political leader is to explain why actually life would be better if we do things the way that will be of long-term benefit, and also greater freedom and a better, good life for the society. And obviously, the pandemic has given us opportunities to think about what was going wrong in our society and how it's all falling apart. And genuine leaders should step in and say, you know what, we could build back a completely different society. And it might look from the old perspective as if that would be less fun, but actually it would be better. It would be better in this way, that way, the cleaner air, the more free time, the public transport would be better. You could ride your bicycle, all sorts of things that you currently can't do because it seems dangerous would become not dangerous, would become more enjoyable, and so on. So you need to paint a picture for people's imagination to see why they might want a society that looks like that. Because even if you didn't have a democracy, you've got to bring the people with you. Otherwise, you'll have a rebellion, right? So whatever kind of system you have, actually, it's going to be democratic in the sense that unless you've convinced the people that this is a trustworthy and good way to go forward, the people will not be happy, and any authority has got to ensure that they've got the people with them, right? So it seems to me that that actually what our problem is that political leaders have not been willing to grasp the nettle and say, look, we could do things very differently. And to some extent, it's happening in Europe that they are taking an opportunity to think again about various things to do with the agriculture and transport and stuff, and work together to say, well, we could actually, if we work together as a European community, we can make things better for all the countries in this place together. But each individual country needs also to be doing it and needs to be presenting at election time a vision of a world that we'd actually want to live in. And at the moment, we're not being offered that at all. We're just being offered, wouldn't you like a tax cut?
No, it's quite interesting. Actually, it relates to, I think, what people said about dealing with the pandemic, and some people have claimed that democracies early in the pandemic, people were saying you need an authoritarian country like China, and democracies don't do well. But then countries like South Korea have done very well, which are democratic. So there doesn't seem to be a direct relation at all. But one thing you mentioned there is
India, for example, particularly good. Yes.
Yeah. So, but what you said along the way there, Flower came in with a supplemental question on a first one about freedom, because you were talking about how one of the problems here is that governments don't like to be seen to be suppressing people's freedom. But so the question really is, is that about challenging the notion of freedom? And of course, there's the famous distinction between positive, negative freedom. I'll leave that for you to explain what the difference is, and perhaps say whether or not you think UBI is important for that positive freedom. And have we over prized negative freedom?
That's a really interesting question. Yes, so I think, so negative freedom is not being constrained, and positive freedom is having the opportunity to freely to do something and choose something else. I guess I don't know if that's a good explanation of it. But anyway, and so I guess what I was talking about with freedom and this idea of leisure and the time and the opportunity and the money to do what you think is really important, and to create a society that can transform itself into a society you'd want to live in. That was very much about positive freedom. It was about freedom to do something different. And I think that perhaps what I'm saying then is that the politicians, if they're to become leaders, need to show us the way in which we would freely choose deliberately to transform our society into a place where people were not stigmatized for being poor, where everybody had the opportunity to do creative things, where you didn't want to drive a car and you did want to take the bus deliberately by choice, because the bus can go straight through because there are no cars, right? The amazing sort of freedom that would emerge from a society that had got rid of its total dependence upon the motor car and the obstruction of the roads that causes, the obstruction of the pavements, the obstruction of the places where we used to play when I was a child, in the roads, that actually we've lost a lot of freedom in things that we took to be a source of freedom. And what appears to be a constraint on the freedom to take that opportunity away would give us back the freedom to do a whole load of things that we would want to choose to do, but we can't at the moment because we're stuck with I use cars as an example, but there are plenty of other things that we've got into the habit of us supposing that they make life possible. But if you took them away, you might find life was better.
Okay, when you mentioned housing earlier, I was connecting that sort of without thinking with another question I saw in the corner of my eye, Maxwell Reese's question, which I think is a very good one here, which is there a philosophical reason why it's preferable to provide people with liquid income as opposed to a basic level of goods and services that serve their basic needs? Because obviously it is interesting if you think about public benefits. I mean, libraries, for example, is a good example of not giving people money but giving them a resource. Social housing perhaps used to be more like that. In a way, does the sort of trend towards thinking of UBI kind of betray sort of still a prejudice towards the idea that what really matters is income rather than what people can actually do in life? So is there a philosophical reason perhaps for why you advocate UBI, or is it purely practical?
That's very interesting. Yes, I hadn't actually stopped to think about the universal basic services thing. So I think that it's really important, at least for, as I understand, the basic income and the reasons for it, that it wouldn't be a substitute for the basic services, that we wouldn't want to get rid of the National Health Service and free healthcare and suddenly say, oh, we gave you the money, you can spend it on healthcare if you like. Or the library's no longer free, you have to pay, but we gave you the money to pay for it. I don't think that this should be a replacement for providing the services that enable people to access things which we actually think are really important for a civilized society. that those things are not charged for and don't detract from your ability to feed yourself or house yourself or whatever. Obviously, in a totally communist society, you could have a distribution of everything, but the point of a cash handout on top of the basic services that we think that make life good would be that the freedom to spend that money on what you've chosen is also important, and the ability of the rich to decide exactly what they're going to eat, exactly what kind of house they're going to live in, exactly what kind of car they're going to have, or their bicycle, or whatever. They have huge arrays of choice and freedom in their lives, which actually help with the functioning of a market society. Because if people can't choose which things are good and worth buying, then you can't decide, you can't let the market decide on quality of productivity. And also, there's no incentive for the butchers and the bakers to produce really nice stuff that would be worth buying. So I think that the injection of cash in the spending power area, where people are actually going out into the marketplace and choosing what they want, is part of what will stimulate a local economy and make a place vibrant, because people go and do something with their money. They go to the cinema or they go to the market, and what they do with that money makes a difference to what other businesses and activities can survive and make a living. And so the spending power of the people affects what's available.
I mean, one thing that always strikes me when people talk about universal basic income is that often people say what it doesn't do and what other bits like services and so forth. But I think what's missing from that is a recognition that, you know, it is not the single policy which solves all ills. It has to be embedded in a certain system where other things are the case. So I think that's it's a bit cheap to kind of claim that it doesn't solve all ills, therefore we should get rid of it.
There's a real danger of from those who think that it could solve all ills. I think that's the one that the really right-wing people want to say, we'll just get rid of all the provisions that we're taxed for and that we provide. Just give the poor people a little bit of money and then let them get on with it. But of course, if you don't have a free healthcare system, then you get a very unhealthy society, and the result is dire.
I mean, actually, that reminds me, because you were saying, talking the evidence for whether it works or not. Again, we don't want to get too much into that because that's the economics and the politics. Yeah. But people do. There have been various pilot studies which people can point to. But I just wondered, a small thought I had was that without having sort of evidence directly, I suppose we do have evidence of the differences between societies where there are greater or lesser what we at the moment call safety nets or social protections. You know, so in other words, in a country like the United States of America, the amount you get as of right from the state is very, very minimal. In somewhere like Scandinavia, it's more. Is there a sense in which that is kind of a proto-experiment for the principle about whether or not societies are improved or not by more default, as it were, wealth distribution? It's just an idle thought, so maybe you've got nothing to say about that.
I think it's an interesting thought. I'm not sure what measure you would want to measure the results by. I mean, obviously there are various things that are extremely good in Scandinavia, partly because of the amount that's done, and there are various things that are pretty bad in America, but maybe not everybody would agree that those things are the goods and the bads. I don't know what. what
That's
exactly.
fine. We can just
Well, anyway,
throw it out
yes.
as something to think about. Listen, just to
Yeah, it's
finish
good
up,
to think about.
and
Yeah.
in a sense, I don't like these sort of general "how do you feel" questions because they don't seem very philosophical. But I can't resist this one. You've been a philosopher for a long time, and you had that pop at practical politics. I'm wondering now, having had those experiences, how you are feeling about both. And perhaps feeling is one word. Perhaps we say what your judgment is on this. Do you have reasons to be hopeful that philosophy can have an important role in informing our political direction? And how much sort of like confidence do you have that politics can actually be a vehicle for meaningful change, or are we just going to constantly see vested interests and power groups sort of come up against it?
Well, I don't know. I waver a bit between thinking that it's perfectly conceivable and possible that the politics could work for the good, and then looking at what actually happens, and especially with our first past the post system, which makes it so difficult uh, to get any real change in the UK, then I think, well, it's going to drift on with lobbyists and large donors and so on having all the power behind the scenes, and the so-called democracy is not really doing very much, and there's very little we can do about it. So I don't know. I mean, of course, part of my perspective is from the point of view of being in a party that has very little influence here, and having lost all our influence in where we did have a lot of influence in the EU, where we could actually see things changing because there were a large body of Green representatives in the Parliament, and then no longer having that, and it not helping us in the UK to keep to set us on the right direction. I find it quite depressing.
On that cheerful note,
But we have to keep trying. Yes.
yeah. Well, we have to just keep trying, don't we? I think
Yeah.
you can't. We have to be realists as philosophers, surely, and then that doesn't
realists,
fit.
but we must keep people thinking and on their toes, and not let them slip into foolish assumptions about what's good and or what's possible.
Several comments and questions have been about more practical matters. For example, a question about whether it's possible to pilot UBI at a supranational level. The answer is yes, such pilots have already taken place. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, apart from thinking about the philosophical sides, there is plenty of good research out there. There are different opinions. There are different versions of UBI being offered, people proposing different levels and the alternative universal basic services. And as I say, plenty of good stuff out there, very accessible stuff. So I hope if you're not already interested, which I'm sure a lot of you were, I hope you sparked your interest to look at some more. This is the penultimate talk. We've got one more talk before we break for Christmas, and hopefully that'll be coming up now. It's next week's with Joseph Chan and Brian Wong, and this is about treating legal transgressions. So the idea here is they'll be talking about what you basically do, about civil disobedience and the legal position we should have towards people practicing civil disobedience, and particularly pertinent theme given that Joseph Chan is based in Hong Kong. Now, because of the time difference, that one is actually going to be a lunchtime talk next week at 1 o'clock. I hope you can join us and take part in the live discussion. If you can't, you can always catch up afterwards. We're then going to have an extended Christmas break. We'll be back in February, which is a bit of a shame because I think most experts would say that you're probably going to have a pretty severe lockdown in January, spurred on by port, beer, and a lot of lack of social distancing over the Christmas holidays. But, you know, a time to rewatch some of the old videos, perhaps getting ready for the next part of the new series. The titles and speakers will be announced very soon on the Royal Institute of Philosophy's website. Please sign up to our newsletter, follow us on social media, or whatever it is you might do. For this evening, it just leaves me to thank, as usual, behind the scenes, Matt Titterton, doing his magic to keep things going smoothly, and but of course mainly to Catherine Rowett. A really interesting and stimulating talk, and lots of interesting stuff coming up in the discussion. So thank you, Catherine, and good night, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you.